Experts couldn't repair complex ship engine until Admiral brought brilliant black Navy veteran. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the calm sea. The naval ship USS Vanguard cruised steadily through the waters on a mission that was crucial for national security. It had been days since they had left port, and the crew had settled into their daily routines. The officers and sailors worked together with precision, their tasks often requiring long hours of focus. The ship's engine, a massive and intricate piece of machinery, had always been a reliable force in keeping them on course. But now there was a problem. The loud clunking sound that echoed through the lower decks of the ship was the first sign that something had gone wrong. The engine, which had hummed steadily for months, sputtered and ground to a halt. A momentary jolt sent a shiver through the entire ship, and the crew's collective breath caught in their throats. They immediately sprung into action, but deep down, they all knew that something serious had happened. Captain Jenkins, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with years of experience, quickly arrived at the scene. His face, usually stern but calm, now betrayed a hint of worry. He stared at the machine in front of him, its complex systems and thick metal walls that once seemed so indestructible, now silent and unresponsive. He had seen mechanical failures before, but nothing of this scale. It wasn't just a malfunction, it was something much worse. Jenkins called in the ship's chief engineer, Lieutenant Commander Harris. Harris was an expert, the ship's go-to problem solver when it came to mechanical breakdowns. But when he arrived, his expression mirrored the captain's worry. He looked at the engine with a furrowed brow, his mind racing to understand what had happened. He tried all the usual methods, checking the fuel lines, verifying the coolant system, inspecting the wires and power grids. Nothing seemed to be out of place. After hours of intense inspection and troubleshooting, Harris had no answers. The engine simply wouldn't start. It was as if something was deeply wrong at the core, something that no one could detect with the standard equipment or methods they had on board. By now, the situation was becoming dire. They were far from any nearby port and couldn't risk being stranded out in the open sea. The mission was too important, and the team had to act fast. The crew's spirits were beginning to sag, and whispers of worry rippled through the ranks. Would they be able to fix the engine in time? Captain Jenkins paced back and forth in the operations room, his hands clenched into fists. He needed a solution, but the problem seemed too complex for anyone on board to handle. The crew had spent hours trying to figure out the issue, but each attempt had been in vain. The once reliable engine, which had powered the USS Vanguard through countless operations, was now dead in the water. Finally, in a moment of frustration, Captain Jenkins made a decision. There was one person he could turn to. A person whose skills and brilliance were known in the Navy, but someone who hadn't been called upon in years. It was risky, and the crew might question his decision, but it was the only choice he had left. Jenkins contacted Navy Command and put in a request for a specialist, someone with the experience and unconventional thinking that might be able to solve the problem. He knew that this person wasn't the typical Navy engineer, but Jenkins had heard enough stories of this man's brilliant problem-solving abilities. The veteran had a reputation for tackling the most difficult challenges, often finding solutions that others couldn't even dream of. And so the decision was made. They would bring him on board no matter the cost. While waiting for the response, Jenkins shared his decision with his officers. Some were skeptical. They had spent hours trying to fix the engine, and they were beginning to lose hope. Others, however, felt a spark of optimism. They had heard rumors of the legendary Navy veteran, a man with a mind unlike any other, who could fix what others could not. As Jenkins waited, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could this outsider really solve the problem? What if he could? What if the veteran didn't live up to his reputation? There was a lot riding on this, and the pressure was mounting. Hours passed, and finally the Admiral received confirmation. The Navy veteran would be brought aboard the ship the following morning. The news spread quickly through the ranks, and the crew buzzed with curiosity. Who was this mysterious individual who was capable of fixing something that no one else could? Would he be the hero they were hoping for, or would he be just another failure in a long line of attempts? The next morning, the ship made preparations to meet the veteran at the nearby airstrip. The crew was a mixture of excitement and doubt. There was no doubt that they needed help, but there was also skepticism. The veteran wasn't a part of the ship's regular team, and there was a fear that his methods would clash with the crew's established processes. When the veteran finally arrived, he stepped off the transport plane with a calm, almost unassuming presence. He wasn't a towering figure like some of the other engineers aboard the ship, and he didn't carry the air of a traditional military officer. His clothes were simple, his demeanor humble. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself that immediately commanded attention. He was introduced to Captain Jenkins and the rest of the officers, and the initial reactions were mixed. Some were impressed by his quiet confidence, while others couldn't help but wonder if this man was truly the solution to their problems. He was introduced as Master Chief Darnell Blake, a Navy veteran with over 20 years of experience in mechanical engineering and problem-solving. But it wasn't just his technical skills that set him apart. It was his unique ability to think outside the box, to see things others couldn't. Blake didn't waste any time. He immediately went down to the engine room, walking past the engineers who had already spent hours working on the ship. He didn't ask questions or look for explanations. Instead, he just started inspecting the engine in silence, his hands moving over the machinery with a practiced precision. As the crew looked on, they couldn't help but notice the difference. Blake wasn't rattled by the complexity of the task. He wasn't bogged down by the constraints of traditional methods. He had a different way of seeing the problem, one that didn't rely on conventional thinking. And as he began to speak with the engineers, it became clear that Blake wasn't like anyone they had ever worked with before. The sun had barely risen when Master Chief Darnell Blake entered the ship's engine room, the smell of metal and oil heavy in the air. He didn't look like someone who was about to change everything for the crew of the USS Vanguard. He was a man of few words, dressed in a simple Navy uniform, his face calm, almost detached from the mounting pressure around him. As he walked through the engine room, his steady footsteps were the only sound that filled the space, a quiet contrast to the frenzied activity that had been going on for hours. The crew had already spent so much time trying to figure out what was wrong with the engine. They had tried the usual tricks, consulted manuals, and followed every procedure they knew, but nothing seemed to work. The engine, once reliable and strong, had failed them, and with no immediate solution in sight, the crew felt like they were on the edge of defeat. Captain Jenkins had done his best to reassure them, but as the hours stretched on, even his confidence began to waver. The mission that they had set out on seemed to be slipping farther out of reach, and the hope that they would be able to finish it began to feel like a distant dream. Then came Blake, who immediately took charge without hesitation. He didn't waste time discussing the failures of the experts or complaining about what had gone wrong. Instead, he simply observed, his eyes moving over the engine with a level of focus that none of the others had managed to achieve. There was something different about him, a quiet intensity that suggested he didn't need to ask for answers, he just knew where to look. As he inspected the massive engine, Blake didn't speak much. He asked a few questions, but mostly he relied on his own observations. The engineers on board watched him, some with skepticism, others with growing curiosity. They couldn't understand why Blake wasn't reacting to the complexity of the problem the way they had. Where they had seen a puzzle, he seemed to see a straightforward task. The crew had tried everything. They had checked the fuel systems, tested the electrical circuits, examined the cooling units, and even calibrated the engine's temperature control. But the engine refused to respond. It was as though it had simply shut down, as if some critical element had failed, but no one could identify which one. And now, after so many hours, the air in the engine room felt heavy, filled with a sense of resignation. Master Chief Blake wasn't bothered by that. He wasn't rushing to find a quick fix, but rather taking his time to understand the root of the issue. The others waited, some pacing nervously, others trying to hide their frustration. Blake's confidence, however, began to work its magic on the crew. His quiet, calm demeanor was reassuring in a way that no amount of words could achieve. Blake paused and ran his fingers along the piping that led into the engine. He examined each part, making sure there was no hidden issue that had been overlooked. Then, without saying a word, he turned to Lieutenant Commander Harris, the ship's chief engineer who had been desperately trying to fix the problem for hours. "It's the pressure valve," Blake said simply. The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Harris, who had been working with the ship's engine for years, shook his head. "We've already checked the pressure valve. It's fine." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Not the valve itself, but the calibration. It's off. That's why the engine can't build pressure properly. The system's been compensating, but it's become inefficient. That's why you can't get it to restart." Harris was taken aback. He had never thought about the issue in that way. The pressure valve had seemed fine, but Blake's suggestion made sense. The engine had been running inefficiently, its system compensating for a small issue that had snowballed into a larger problem. Blake had seen something the others hadn't, and his quick assessment proved that. Blake turned to one of the engineers nearby. "Get me the calibration tools," he said, his voice low but firm. The engineer hesitated for a moment before rushing to get the equipment. The rest of the crew watched closely, some still doubtful that this unassuming man would be able to fix what so many had failed to repair. As the tools were brought to Blake, he moved with efficiency, quickly adjusting the calibration on the pressure valve. It was a simple process, one that the other engineers had missed because they were too focused on more complex systems. Blake's approach was different. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, he focused on the small details, the things that were often overlooked. He had an intuitive understanding of machinery that came from years of experience, a knack for noticing what others didn't. The crew watched in silence, unsure if this would be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Blake continued to adjust the valve, working with a level of precision that seemed almost effortless. After several minutes, he stood back and nodded. "Try it now." Lieutenant Commander Harris didn't hesitate. He immediately moved to the controls and activated the engine once more. There was a long pause, and for a moment nothing happened. But then, slowly, the engine began to hum. The sound started faint, but it grew louder, stronger, until the entire ship could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath their feet. The crew erupted into cheers. The engine had started again. Against all odds, Blake had found the solution. His calm, methodical approach had paid off, and the USS Vanguard was back on course. Captain Jenkins, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had known that bringing Blake aboard was a risk, but now it seemed like the right decision. He walked over to the veteran, offering a firm handshake. "I'm glad I called you," Jenkins said with a smile. "I should have done it sooner." Blake simply nodded. "Just doing my job, sir." But there was more than just pride in his words. Blake wasn't interested in the spotlight, nor did he seek accolades. He was a man who found satisfaction in fixing problems, in solving the puzzles that others couldn't. As the crew celebrated, Blake quietly observed the engine's operation, making sure everything was running smoothly. His work wasn't done yet. He needed to ensure that the repairs were permanent. But for now, the USS Vanguard was up and running, and the mission was back on track. The crew of the USS Vanguard had learned something important that day. They had learned that sometimes the solution to a problem isn't about being the loudest or the most confident. It's about taking the time to understand the issue, focusing on the details, and thinking in ways that others might overlook. And in Master Chief Blake, they had seen the true value of unconventional thinking and quiet brilliance. The USS Vanguard now hummed with the steady rhythm of its engine. The crew was still riding the high of their successful repair, but their attention quickly shifted from celebration to curiosity. The arrival of Master Chief Darnell Blake had been a game-changer, and the crew found themselves both grateful for his skills and intrigued by the quiet man who had saved the day. His calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the chaotic energy they'd experienced earlier. The veteran's arrival was more than just about fixing the engine. It was about something deeper, something that the crew had never anticipated. The veteran's quiet authority had sparked a shift in the atmosphere aboard the ship. In just a few short hours, Blake had transformed a desperate situation into one of quiet confidence. But this transformation had not been without its challenges. There was still a sense of disbelief among many of the crew members. They couldn't understand why a man, who wasn't even a part of the regular crew, had been able to solve what they thought was an insurmountable problem. And though they were grateful, they were still unsure about how to approach him. As the ship continued on its mission, Captain Jenkins began to notice a shift in the dynamic of the crew. Before, there had been an air of uncertainty. Officers who were used to solving problems were now questioning themselves. But since Blake had come on board, the energy had changed. There was a quiet confidence that had returned to the crew, a belief that no challenge was too great. Master Chief Blake had never sought attention, and he certainly wasn't interested in accolades. To him, fixing the engine had been another task, another puzzle to solve. It was the way his mind worked. His calm, deliberate actions had earned him respect from the crew, but it was his humility that had won their hearts. Blake was aware of the way the crew had looked at him. Some officers were trying to hide their curiosity, and some had already begun to recognize his brilliance. But Blake wasn't one to bask in glory. He wasn't here for the recognition. He was here to do what needed to be done. His hands had already worked through dozens of engines and systems during his years in the Navy, and he knew that the problems that often stumped others were often the result of missed details. It was these small, overlooked components that could lead to failure if they weren't fixed. Captain Jenkins, observing all of this, decided it was time to talk to Blake. The veteran had been working silently on a few other minor repairs around the ship, making sure everything was operating smoothly. Jenkins knew that the true extent of Blake's expertise had not yet fully been revealed. It was time to learn more about the man who had turned things around so quickly. "Master Chief," Jenkins began, walking up to Blake, who was working in the engineering bay. "I want to thank you again for your help with the engine. You've earned the respect of the crew. But there's something else I need to know." Blake didn't look up from his work but responded with a simple, "What's that, sir?" Jenkins hesitated for a moment. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but there was a curiosity that burned inside him. "I've heard a lot of stories about you. I know your reputation precedes you, but I want to know the full story. How did you come to be so skilled in these repairs? You're not just a Navy mechanic, you're something else." Blake set down his tools and turned to face Jenkins. The lines on his face deepened as he thought for a moment. "I grew up working with machines. My father was a mechanic, and I spent my childhood fixing engines in our garage. I learned early that the key to understanding any machine is to get inside its workings, to feel the system as a whole. Most people look at things as individual parts, but I've always believed the whole is more than the sum of its pieces." Jenkins listened intently, knowing there was more to Blake's story than just mechanical genius. "And how did you end up here on this ship?" Blake smiled faintly, a rare expression that softened his usually serious face. "I didn't come to the Navy because I wanted to be a hero. I came because I wanted to serve. I'm not interested in being in the spotlight. I just do my job the best I can. Sometimes that means solving problems that others think are unsolvable. I've been fortunate enough to have that opportunity." Captain Jenkins couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for Blake, not just for his skills, but for his mindset. In an environment like the Navy, where authority and pride were often valued above all else, Blake stood apart. His humility was rare, and it was this very humility that had earned him the respect of everyone who worked alongside him. For the first time, Jenkins realized that Blake's expertise wasn't simply about fixing machines. It was about fixing what others couldn't see. He had the ability to assess a situation and find a solution that no one else could even imagine. This wasn't just mechanical knowledge. It was a way of thinking that could change the way the Navy operated. Blake's story wasn't just about his skill with engines. It was about his understanding of the world. He had learned to look beyond the obvious, to observe and listen, to understand the bigger picture. The engine wasn't just a machine to him. It was a system, an interconnected puzzle that needed to be understood in order to be repaired. The rest of the crew began to notice the changes Blake had made to the ship's operations. Engineers who had once doubted him now found themselves asking for his input. Blake's presence was changing the way people approached their work. They weren't just looking for quick fixes anymore, they were looking for real solutions. Blake's influence spread beyond the engine room. The officers began to approach him for advice on various tasks, from maintenance procedures to more complex mechanical issues. It wasn't long before Blake had earned the trust of everyone on board. He wasn't just a man who fixed engines. He was a man who fixed the way people thought about problems. His approach was methodical, thoughtful, and respectful of the knowledge that each person brought to the table. But despite the respect he had earned, Blake never sought recognition. He was content to remain in the background, quietly solving problems, making adjustments, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. He had never asked for anything more than the opportunity to serve, and in doing so, he had earned the admiration of those around him. As the USS Vanguard continued its mission, Blake's influence grew. He had become a symbol of what it meant to approach challenges with humility and determination. The crew had learned something important, that the best solutions often come from unexpected places, and that brilliance doesn't always need to be loud to be powerful. The USS Vanguard had been sailing smoothly for several days now, thanks to the repairs Master Chief Blake had made. However, the mission wasn't over yet, and everyone knew that more challenges lay ahead. The ship's crew, now filled with a new sense of respect and appreciation for Blake, continued their work, but something about the way Blake worked had left a lasting impact on everyone. Blake wasn't one to rest on his laurels. While the engine was up and running, he had made it clear that he would continue to monitor the ship's systems closely. As he walked through the ship, checking equipment and making minor adjustments, the crew couldn't help but watch in admiration. His presence on board had created a shift in the way they worked, an energy that wasn't just about fixing things, but about understanding how everything fit together. Captain Jenkins had noticed this shift more than anyone. Before Blake arrived, the crew had been competent but lacked the unity that came from a deeper understanding of the machinery they were working with. Now, there was a sense of purpose to their actions. They didn't just repair engines or maintain systems. They looked at the ship as a whole, identifying potential issues before they became problems. Blake had shown them the value of foresight, of taking the time to understand the bigger picture, and not rushing through tasks just to check them off the list. While the engine had been fixed, Captain Jenkins couldn't help but feel that something was still missing. The ship's mission was critical, and there was no room for failure. He called Blake into his office, hoping to discuss the next steps for the ship. Blake entered, his face as calm and composed as always, but there was an air of seriousness around him. He knew why Jenkins had called him. "Master Chief," Captain Jenkins began, looking at Blake with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "The engine is working, but I want to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. I've seen the way you think about these problems, and I need your input. What do you recommend we do moving forward?" Blake sat down across from Jenkins, his hands folded in front of him. "We need to make sure the systems are operating at their full potential," he said. "The engine is running, yes, but it's only one part of the ship's overall system. We can't afford to have anything else fail while we're out here." Jenkins nodded. "I agree, but how do we do that? We can't afford to wait for something else to break down before we fix it." Blake leaned forward slightly. "It's about preventive maintenance. It's not just about fixing things when they break, it's about making sure they don't break in the first place. I've noticed a few areas of the ship that could use some attention. They're not broken, but they could become problems if we don't address them." Captain Jenkins listened intently as Blake outlined his plan. It wasn't about making drastic changes, but about identifying weaknesses before they became critical. Blake had a keen eye for these things, and it was clear that he wasn't just thinking about the engine. He was thinking about the entire ship, every system, every component. He had a way of seeing things that others didn't. Blake's approach was methodical, but it was also thoughtful. He didn't rush through the repairs or adjustments. He took his time, carefully inspecting each part of the ship. He understood that a single small malfunction could have a ripple effect on the rest of the systems. And so he went through each area with precision, making sure everything was running as smoothly as possible. As Blake worked alongside the crew, he shared his knowledge with them, teaching them not just how to fix things, but how to think about problems in a new way. He encouraged the engineers to slow down, to take the time to understand the machines they were working on. It wasn't enough to just follow the manual or fix things when they broke. They needed to think critically, to ask questions, and to understand the larger systems at play. Over the next few days, Blake's influence continued to spread. The engineers began to adopt his methods, taking a more proactive approach to maintenance. They didn't just fix things, they prevented problems before they could even occur. Blake had changed the way they thought about their work, and it was making a real difference. But it wasn't just the engineers who were learning from Blake. Captain Jenkins watched as the ship's officers began to adopt his mindset as well. They became more aware of their own roles in the mission, thinking ahead and considering the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about doing their jobs. It was about understanding how their jobs fit into the larger picture of the mission. Jenkins was impressed by how quickly the crew had adapted to Blake's approach. It was clear that the veteran's influence was having a lasting impact on the ship, but there was still the matter of the mission itself. The USS Vanguard was heading into dangerous waters, and Jenkins knew that they couldn't afford any more mistakes. Blake had given the crew the tools they needed to prevent failure, but now it was up to them to execute. "Master Chief," Jenkins said one afternoon as he observed the crew working, "I can see the difference in the way the crew operates now. I think we're ready for what comes next, but I want to make sure we stay prepared. I want to ensure that nothing goes wrong from here on out." Blake nodded. "I'll continue to monitor everything, but the key is to stay vigilant. You can't let your guard down even when things seem to be running smoothly. That's when the problems creep in." Jenkins agreed. The mission ahead was critical, and there was no room for failure. But with Blake's help, he felt more confident than ever that the USS Vanguard and her crew would be ready for anything that came their way. Blake had shown them that the difference between success and failure wasn't just about solving problems. It was about preventing them before they started. As Blake continued to work alongside the crew, he found himself thinking about the bigger picture about what this mission meant. It wasn't just about fixing the engine or ensuring that the ship systems were operating properly. It was about something greater. It was about serving with integrity, about using his skills to help others, and about making sure that the USS Vanguard could complete its mission, no matter the obstacles. In the days that followed, the crew's confidence grew. They had learned to trust in their work, in their training, and in each other. Blake had taught them something invaluable. That success didn't come from rushing through tasks or solving problems as they came up. It came from being prepared, from understanding the systems you were working with, and from thinking ahead. By the time they reached their destination, the USS Vanguard was operating like a well-oiled machine. The crew had become a team, working together seamlessly to ensure that the ship remained in top condition. And through it all, Master Chief Blake had remained in the background, quietly making adjustments, offering advice, and continuing to teach those around him. The crew would never forget the lessons he had taught them, the lessons of patience, foresight, and humility. They had learned that true expertise wasn't just about fixing problems when they arose. It was about preventing them from happening in the first place. And for that, they had Master Chief Darnell Blake to thank. The USS Vanguard had been at sea for weeks now, the vast expanse of the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The crew had become accustomed to the steady hum of the engine, the way it powered the ship through the waves, steady and reliable. It was a far cry from the tense, uncertain days before Master Chief Blake had joined the ship. Now there was a new sense of confidence on board. The ship's systems were running smoothly, the crew was working together as a team, and the mission seemed to be progressing without incident. But even with everything in motion, Captain Jenkins knew that there was still work to be done. The breakthrough that Blake had brought to the USS Vanguard wasn't just about fixing the engine. It was about more than that. It was about creating a culture of preparedness and attention to detail. Blake had taught them to look deeper, to think ahead, and to be proactive instead of reactive. And the crew had embraced that mindset with open arms. But now, as the ship neared its final destination, there was a final challenge that lay ahead, a challenge that no one had anticipated. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a wrench or a tool, but something that required the very same mindset Blake had instilled in the crew. The mission was critical, and the stakes had never been higher. It was at this moment, with the ocean stretching out before them and the mission almost within reach, that Blake's influence would truly be put to the test. The morning was unusually quiet. The crew had just completed their daily drills and routine checks. Everyone was on edge, aware that the ship was entering a high-stakes situation. They had trained for this moment, but there was a quiet tension in the air. Captain Jenkins stood on the bridge, looking out at the horizon. The sense of calm that had settled over the ship in recent days seemed fragile. They were close to their objective, but something in the back of his mind told him that they couldn't afford to be complacent. Blake, as usual, was working below deck. He'd been performing his usual checks on the ship's machinery, making minor adjustments, and ensuring everything was running smoothly. But there was something different in the air that day. Something wasn't quite right. Blake could feel it as he moved from room to room, inspecting the ship's systems. It was a nagging feeling, one that told him something was just off. It wasn't a specific issue with the engine or a mechanical failure. It was something else. The ship was fine on the surface, but Blake knew that sometimes things could go wrong in ways that no one could predict. As the day wore on, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that they were overlooking something. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there, like a whisper in the back of his mind. He decided to take a walk around the ship, moving through the various sections to check on the crew. The officers were busy with their tasks, but there was a sense of unease in the air that Blake couldn't ignore. Something was coming, and they needed to be prepared. He walked past the control room where Lieutenant Commander Harris was sitting at his desk, his face tense with concentration. "Harris," Blake called out, "how's everything running?" Harris looked up from his work and smiled, though there was a slight edge to his expression. "Everything's fine. We're still running at full capacity, just checking some readings but nothing out of the ordinary." Blake nodded, though his intuition told him otherwise. "Good, but keep an eye on everything. Sometimes when things seem too calm, that's when you need to be the most cautious." Harris raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "I'll keep that in mind, Master Chief." Blake continued his rounds, checking each section of the ship carefully. The crew seemed to be on edge, but there was no obvious reason for it. The systems were functioning well, the engines were humming, and the ship was in good condition. And yet, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a challenge they hadn't anticipated. It wasn't until the late afternoon that the situation began to unfold. The alarms rang out across the ship, their shrill tone cutting through the air and sending the crew into a flurry of action. The calm that had settled over the USS Vanguard vanished in an instant. Everyone rushed to their stations, the sense of urgency palpable in the air. Blake's instincts were right, something was wrong, but this time it wasn't the engine. It was something far more complex. Captain Jenkins was on the bridge in seconds, his face set with determination. "Report," he barked. Lieutenant Harris, who had been monitoring the ship systems, looked up in alarm. "We've detected a significant anomaly in the communication system. There's interference. We can't send or receive any messages. It's coming from somewhere outside the ship." Jenkins' heart raced. This was no ordinary malfunction. They were in a high-risk area, and if they couldn't communicate with headquarters or allies, they were vulnerable. The crew was trained for situations like this, but there was always a sense of dread when something went wrong. Blake, who had been nearby, immediately sprang into action. "I need a full diagnostic of the comm systems," he ordered, "and I need it now." "Harris, get to the engine room. I'll handle this." Blake's calm leadership in the face of chaos was what had kept the crew together during their most difficult moments. Without hesitation, the crew followed his instructions. Blake moved to the communication panel, quickly running his hands over the controls. His mind worked faster than his hands could keep up, evaluating the signals, looking for the source of the interference. It wasn't just a malfunction, it was intentional. The minutes felt like hours as Blake worked tirelessly to identify the source of the problem. The crew watched from the sidelines, unsure of what was happening but trusting Blake to find a solution. Harris was working below deck, making sure the ship's engine remained intact, but they all knew that the comms system was their most critical link to the outside world. If the interference was too strong, they could be left isolated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Blake's voice broke the silence. "I've isolated the signal. It's coming from a nearby vessel. Someone is jamming our communications." Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "Can you reverse it?" Blake didn't hesitate. "I can try. But it'll take some time. I'll need to reroute power to the comms system and override the external signal." The crew held their breath as Blake worked. It was a delicate procedure, and any mistake could make the situation worse. But Blake's steady hand never wavered. He knew exactly what needed to be done. Slowly, methodically, he rerouted the power and began the painstaking task of reversing the interference. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as the crew waited. And then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the comms system hummed back to life. The crackling noise faded as the interference was lifted. A clear signal emerged, and the crew could hear the voice of their headquarters. "We've got you back, Vanguard," the voice said, relief evident in their tone. "What's your status?" Blake exhaled, allowing himself a moment of relief. "Status report incoming. We're good. All systems are stable." Captain Jenkins, who had been watching Blake with admiration, nodded. "Good work, Master Chief. We wouldn't have made it through this without you." Blake's expression remained unchanged. "Just doing my job, sir." As the ship continued its journey, the crew knew that they had overcome a critical obstacle. It wasn't just about fixing engines or solving mechanical problems. It was about being prepared for whatever came their way, about staying calm under pressure and trusting the expertise of those around them. The breakthrough wasn't just in the way the USS Vanguard had overcome the interference. It was in the way Blake had changed the entire crew. They were no longer just a group of individuals working together. They were a team that knew how to adapt, how to think ahead, and how to stay focused on the bigger picture. They had learned the importance of preparation, of staying vigilant, and of always being ready for the unexpected. As Blake moved through the ship, he couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The crew had come together in ways that he had never expected. He had done what he set out to do, not just fixing machines, but fixing the way people thought about their work. And for him, that was the real success. The USS Vanguard had completed its mission successfully, the crew having navigated through one of the most intense and unpredictable assignments in the ship's history. The tension that had once hung thick over the vessel had finally dissolved into relief and pride. It was a triumph that no one had expected at the outset, least of all the crew themselves. But now, as the ship made its way back toward the familiar waters of the home port, the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. Master Chief Darnell Blake had been an integral part of the ship's success, not just for fixing the engine or resolving the communication interference, but for changing the very mindset of the crew. His influence had gone beyond just mechanical expertise. He had shown them what it meant to be truly prepared, to think ahead, and to work as a cohesive unit rather than isolated individuals. His quiet leadership had guided them through moments of uncertainty and helped them realize that the true power of a crew wasn't in the machines they operated, but in the way they worked together, with understanding and foresight. Blake's role had been pivotal, but he remained humble as always. He never sought attention or recognition for his work, but instead simply did his job, believing that the mission itself was more important than any personal glory. Still, as the crew gathered on deck in the aftermath of the successful mission, Captain Jenkins felt a deep sense of gratitude. There was no doubt that without Blake, the USS Vanguard would not have made it through this challenging assignment. "Gather up, everyone," Captain Jenkins called out over the loudspeakers, his voice steady but full of pride. "I think it's time we recognize someone who has done more for this crew than we can all express." The crew began to assemble on deck, their faces eager, yet filled with curiosity about what the captain was going to say. They had all grown accustomed to Blake's quiet efficiency, his unassuming nature, but they had also come to respect him as one of the most capable and intelligent individuals they had ever worked with. No one had expected him to be the source of the transformation that had taken place aboard the Vanguard. The ship was now running better than ever, and the crew had become more cohesive, more in tune with each other than they had been before. It was clear that Blake had been the catalyst for that change. As the crew stood assembled, Captain Jenkins turned to Blake, who was standing quietly at the back of the group, his hands tucked behind his back. He wasn't one for fanfare, but Jenkins knew that Blake deserved this moment. "Master Chief Blake," Jenkins began, his voice carrying across the deck, "when you first arrived aboard this ship, we were in a difficult place. We were facing challenges we didn't have answers for. But with your knowledge, your experience, and your quiet leadership, you have turned everything around. You have not only repaired our engines, but have also repaired the very way we approach our work." The crew was silent as Jenkins continued. "You've taught us the value of foresight, of paying attention to the details, and of not rushing to conclusions. You've shown us that the strength of a crew lies not just in how well we operate machines, but in how well we work together, how well we understand each other's roles, and how we can rely on each other in the toughest of times." Jenkins paused for a moment, and the weight of his words settled on the crew. Blake's influence had been nothing short of transformative. It wasn't just his mechanical skill that had made the difference, but his ability to shift the mindset of everyone around him. He had reminded them all that success didn't come from isolated brilliance, but from collective effort, thoughtfulness, and attention to every detail. "And for all of that," Jenkins continued, "I think it's only fitting that we recognize your contribution." I want to present you with the Navy Commendation Medal for your outstanding service to this crew and your exceptional skill in guiding us through this mission. You've not only fixed engines, you've fixed the way we work." There was a moment of silence before the crew broke into applause. The sound echoed across the deck, a deep, genuine expression of appreciation and respect. Blake, ever humble, stood quietly as Jenkins pinned the medal on his chest. He had never sought recognition, but as he looked out at the crew's faces, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Not for the medal itself, but for the change he had helped bring about. This was the reward he valued, the knowledge that he had made a difference in the way the crew thought, worked, and interacted with each other. As the applause died down, Blake took a step forward, addressing the crew for the first time since the mission had ended. His voice was quiet but steady, filled with sincerity. "I didn't come here to get a medal. I came because I wanted to help. What's important is not what I've done, but what you all have learned. The success of this mission wasn't about me, it was about all of us working together." The crew stood still, absorbing his words. Blake had always been about the team. He had never sought to place the spotlight on himself, and yet, in this moment, it was clear that his impact had been immense. His approach to leadership, his calm, methodical way of solving problems, and his commitment to teaching others had changed the USS Vanguard and the way its crew operated. As the crew celebrated the completion of the mission and the recognition of their shared success, there was a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. They had learned not only about the importance of technical expertise, but about the value of working together and recognizing that the success of any mission wasn't just about solving problems. It was about preventing them, anticipating what might go wrong, and being prepared for anything. Captain Jenkins knew that Blake had given the crew something far more valuable than a repaired engine. He had given them the tools to work better together, to approach problems with a fresh perspective, and to face challenges with confidence. And that, Jenkins knew, would make them stronger in the future. Blake may have left the spotlight when the ceremony ended, slipping back into his usual quiet routine, but his impact on the USS Vanguard would never fade. His time on board had changed the crew for good, and his legacy would continue to influence the way they worked for years to come. As Jenkins looked out over the deck at his crew, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the veteran who had made all of this possible, a man who had changed the USS Vanguard in ways that no one could have predicted. As the ship sailed back home, the crew knew that they had learned something that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. They knew that Blake's lessons about foresight, teamwork, and the value of thinking ahead, would continue to guide them long after the mission was over. They had been shaped by Blake's wisdom, and now they were a better, stronger, and more capable crew because of it.